You're doing 80 miles an hour somewhere in Pennsylvania, and suddenly your locomotive starts shaking like it wants to tear itself apart. The wheels are slipping, but you're not starting from a station. You're at full speed on the main line. You cut the throttle, pray the drivers catch the rail again, then slowly ease the power back in, hoping it doesn't happen again before the next curve. That was life on the Pennsylvania Railroad's T1 Duplex, and the engineers who ran them had a saying: the average engineer simply did not acquire the finesse to operate these machines. But the T1 wasn't alone. Throughout railroad history, there have been locomotives that looked impressive on paper, performed well in tests, and then made life absolutely miserable for the men who actually had to run them day after day. These are the locomotives that crews dreaded seeing on the assignment board, the ones they complained about in crew rooms and cursed in rail yard bars. Some were dangerous, some were uncomfortable, and some were so poorly designed that the government had to step in and ban them entirely. This is the story of the most hated locomotives by their own crews ever. Let's start with that Pennsylvania Railroad nightmare, the T1 Duplex. The Pennsylvania Railroad was obsessed with being the best, and in the early 1940s they thought they had designed the ultimate passenger locomotive. Raymond Loewy gave it that gorgeous streamlined shroud, the kind of locomotive that looked like it belonged on a magazine cover. Underneath all that pretty bodywork was a 4-4-4-4 wheel arrangement, meaning 2 sets of 4 driving wheels instead of 1 set of 8. The idea was that smaller driving wheels would have less reciprocating mass, allowing higher speeds with less track damage. On paper, it made sense. In reality, it created a machine that wanted to kill you. The problem was wheel slip, and not the kind you get when starting a heavy train from a dead stop. Every engineer knows how to handle that. The T1 would slip at speed, at 80 miles an hour or more, which was terrifying in a way that's hard to explain unless you've experienced it. When the pilot truck and front driving wheels passed over a rail irregularity, they would slip and catch. Then the rear drivers would hit the same spot and slip again. Sometimes the imbalance caused the front drivers to slip a second time while you were still dealing with the first slip. Trains magazine put it plainly: wheel slippage is bad enough at low speeds, but a slip at 80 miles an hour was a scary proposition. The engineers who mastered the T1 developed an almost supernatural feel for the locomotive, knowing exactly when to cut power and when to ease it back in. But most engineers never developed that feel, and the railroad knew it. The average engineer did not acquire the finesse to operate a T1, they admitted, which is a polite way of saying the locomotive was too dangerous for normal service. The mechanical side wasn't any better. Those Franklin poppet valves that were supposed to be the future of steam technology kept breaking at high speeds, and the components were nearly inaccessible within the frame. The beautiful streamlined shrouding that made the T1 look so impressive actually blocked access to critical maintenance points. Mechanics had to work around the skirting over the driving wheels just to reach the cam boxes above the cylinders. Despite regular washing, the T1s always looked dirty and tarnished, belching excessive smoke in a way that embarrassed the railroad that prided itself on being the standard railroad of the world. By 1948, the Pennsylvania had seen enough. They dieselized all first-class passenger trains and sent the T1s to secondary service, where they continued to terrify engineers until the last one was scrapped in 1956. Only 52 were ever built, and not a single one was preserved. The railroad that once called itself the standard railroad of the world scrapped every last T1 without saving even one for history. That tells you everything about how they felt about these machines by the end. Now let's go back further in time, to a design so dangerous that the federal government eventually banned it. The Camelback locomotive, also called the Mother Hubbard, put the engineer's cab directly over the boiler, straddling it like riding a horse. The fireman stayed at the back, in front of the firebox where he belonged, but the engineer sat up front, perched above the driving rods in a tiny cab that offered almost no protection from anything. The Baltimore and Ohio crews had a name for these locomotives. They called them snappers, and that name tells you everything you need to know about why they hated them. If a side rod broke at speed and side rods did break, the flying metal would come straight up into the engineer's cab. There was nothing between him and those spinning, reciprocating parts except a thin floor and hope. The B&O Railroad Museum has documented cases where a Camelback engineer perished in the cab, while the oblivious firemen at the rear continued to stoke the fire, completely unaware that anything had happened. The two crew members were so far apart that they couldn't communicate, couldn't see each other, and in an emergency couldn't help each other. The engineer had no way to know if the fireman had collapsed from heat exhaustion, and the fireman had no way to know if the engineer had been killed by a snapped rod. The engineer's position was miserable even when nothing went wrong. That cab straddled the hottest part of the boiler, and in summer months, engineers endured conditions that put them at serious risk of heat stroke. They sat there for entire shifts, baking above the boiler, with no relief except the wind when the locomotive was moving. The fireman had the opposite problem. He was completely exposed to the weather, standing on an open platform at the rear while trying to balance himself and shovel coal into the firebox. Rain, snow, freezing wind, summer heat, he got all of it with no protection whatsoever. The Interstate Commerce Commission finally stepped in and banned further construction of Camelback locomotives in 1918, but they didn't stop there. In 1927, they prohibited any future orders at all, effectively ending the Camelback era entirely. The government doesn't ban locomotive designs lightly, and when they do, you know the crews have been complaining for a long time. Across the Atlantic during the Second World War, British locomotive crews were dealing with their own nightmare, a class of engines designed to be cheap, simple, and disposable. The War Department Austerity 280 was built to haul military supplies across bomb-damaged tracks in conditions where nobody expected the locomotives to last more than 2 years anyway. The designers stripped out everything that made a locomotive comfortable or refined, and the crews paid the price. They called them bed irons, and the name came from the noise. These locomotives clanked and banged as they moved, producing sounds that train spotters of the era still remember decades later. The rough riding qualities made them deeply unpopular with crews who had to spend entire shifts being shaken and rattled at speeds that couldn't safely exceed 40 miles an hour. The Austerity 280 used a steel firebox instead of the traditional copper, which saved money but meant the firebox wouldn't last as long. The wheels were cast iron instead of steel. The driving wheels weren't properly balanced, which contributed to that bone-jarring ride quality. The boilers had no lagging, relying on a 2-inch airspace for insulation that didn't really work. Every cost-cutting measure the designers implemented made life worse for the crews who had to run these machines. To be fair, these locomotives were designed for a specific purpose: winning a war. They saved 6,000 man-hours of construction time compared to the standard LMS 8F, which meant more locomotives reaching the front lines faster. But when the war ended and these rough riders remained in service, crews who had expected them to disappear found themselves stuck with them for another 2 decades. The dropgate mechanism in the ashpan kept warping and burning out. The fireboxes developed cracks at the tube plates, a problem that plagued them throughout their service life. Some batches had such defective boiler steel that they were scrapped before 1945 even ended, their metal failing under pressure that any normal locomotive would have handled easily. 935 of these machines were built, and crews on both sides of the English Channel learned to dread seeing one assigned to their train. Back in America, Southern Pacific crews faced a different kind of terror: suffocation. The railroad's main line through the Sierra Nevada mountains included 39 tunnels and 40 miles of snow sheds, and in conventional locomotives, all that exhaust had nowhere to go except back into the crew's faces. The problem was simple physics. A steam locomotive pushes its exhaust up and back, and in open air that's fine. But in a tunnel or snow shed, the exhaust fills the enclosed space and wraps right back around into the cab. Southern Pacific tested conventional 2882 locomotives on this route, and the trials nearly killed the crews. The great volume of exhaust gases almost asphyxiated the men running these tests, and that was under controlled conditions with everyone paying attention. Crews developed desperate countermeasures. They rigged up respirators that took air from the locomotive's main reservoir, feeding it through tubes to their mouths and noses. It gave some relief from the smoke and fumes, but they still had to endure the heat, the deafening noise, and the hot steam that filled the cab whenever they opened the firebox door. One engineer got creative and turned his locomotive around, running it backwards so the exhaust went behind him instead of into his face. That worked well enough that Southern Pacific eventually developed the cab-forward design, putting the crew at the front of the locomotive where the exhaust couldn't reach them. But that solution came too late for the crews who had already spent years choking through Sierra tunnels. The danger wasn't theoretical. In 1941, a cab-forward locomotive with leaking steam pipes entered a tunnel at Santa Susana Pass and began slipping on the wet rails. The train stalled inside the tunnel, which rapidly filled with exhaust fumes and steam. Oil dripping from the locomotive's firebox ignited on the ties beneath the cab, and the crew was killed before they could escape. The very tunnels that cab-forwards were designed to conquer still claimed lives when something went wrong. Our final locomotive represents a different kind of betrayal, one where the crews weren't endangered by design flaws, but cheated by the company that built their machines. The Chesapeake in Ohio's H8 Allegheny was a magnificent 2666, one of the most powerful steam locomotives ever constructed. Lima Locomotive Works built 60 of them between 1941 and 1948, and they performed exactly as advertised on the mountain grades they were designed to conquer. The problem was the weight. Railroad crews in this era were paid based on the weight on the driving wheels of their locomotives. A heavier locomotive meant a bigger paycheck, and crews kept track of these numbers carefully. When the H8S arrived, Lima provided weight specifications that determined how much the engineers and firemen would earn for every run. Then the maintenance crews actually weighed the locomotives and discovered something infuriating. The H8S came in at 771,300 pounds, thousands of pounds heavier than Lima had originally claimed. This wasn't a minor discrepancy or a rounding error. The crews had been systematically underpaid for every single run they made, and they saw this misrepresentation as an attack on their livelihood. The Chesapeake in Ohio had to pay their crews thousands of dollars in back wages to make up the difference, money that should have been in their paychecks from the beginning. The railroad then turned around and sued Lima for over $3 million in 1944, a lawsuit that historians say kickstarted Lima's decline as a locomotive manufacturer. The H8S themselves were excellent locomotives, but the men who ran them never forgot that they had been cheated. Every engineer who climbed into that cab knew that Lima had lied about the weight, knew that he had been underpaid, and knew that the only reason he got his money back was because someone bothered to put the locomotive on a scale. These 5 locomotives represent different eras and different problems, but they all share one thing in common. The men who ran them hated them. The T1 with its terrifying wheel slip at speed. The Camelbacks that put engineers directly above spinning death. Not the bed irons that shook crews apart on every run. The tunnel-choking conventional locomotives of the Sierra, and the H8S that represented corporate dishonesty more than engineering failure. Railroad companies could look at blueprints and test results and performance specifications all day long, but the real test of any locomotive was whether the crews trusted it. These machines failed that test, and the men who ran them made sure everyone knew it. They complained in crew rooms. They filed grievances with their unions. They told stories in bars after their shifts. And in at least one case, they complained so loudly and so persistently that the federal government stepped in and banned the design entirely. The next time you see a preserved steam locomotive gleaming in a museum, remember that not every locomotive earned that kind of respect. Some of them were so hated by the men who ran them that nobody wanted to save them, and the only memories that remain are the stories told by the crews who survived them. Those stories matter because they tell us something that the engineering specifications never could, what it actually felt like to run these machines day after day, hoping nothing would go wrong.